Hello, my name's Katrine Sasaki and I'm the Agriculture Attaché at the British Embassy in Tokyo. And I'm going to give a short presentation on Japan's dairy market. So in terms of what I'm going to cover in this presentation, firstly, I'm going to give an overview of Japan's dairy sector. Then I'll give an overview of Japan's cheese market. Then move into the challenges and opportunities for cheese exporters. I'll then briefly discuss about other dairy products, and then I'll give a very short introduction to the Japanese buyers who will be attending the dairy showcase in the UK. The dairy industry is an important one for Japan, and milk is actually the second most produced agricultural product after rice. Most dairy produce comes from the northern part of Japan, which is, as you can see from the map, the Tohoku and Hokkaido regions. And dairy farming is a really important part of the economy in these areas. But compared to other countries, farms in Japan tend to be small or medium-sized businesses, and they lack the economies of scale to make them really competitive. As well as this, Japan's dairy farms face other issues such as an aging workforce and a shortage of younger people wanting to become farmers. And this is quite similar to other agricultural industries in Japan, which face similar challenges. The industry is highly protected, and the government intervenes to adjust supply to meet demand. But around 37% of dairy products consumed in Japan are imported, and cheese and butter make up a big proportion of those imports. So traditionally, the Japanese diet has not included much dairy, but this has changed significantly over the past few decades. And milk, cheese, yogurt, butter, ice cream are all now widely consumed in Japan. Meiji, Morinaga, and Megmilk Snowbrand are some of the big domestic dairy companies, and they all produce a variety of dairy products. So on this slide, we can see cheese consumption in 2021 in different countries. Cheese consumption has been steadily increasing in Japan, but it's still relatively low, as you can see from this chart, around 340 metric tons in 2021. And this is only around half the level of consumption in the UK, which the chart shows was around 760 metric tons in 2021. And on this next chart, you can see the per capita consumption of cheese in different countries. And you can see that in Japan in 2021, per capita consumption was around 2.7 kilograms. This is pretty low compared to other countries on this chart, including the UK, where, for comparison, per capita consumption was around 11.3 kilograms in 2021. Japan is, as I've mentioned before, heavily reliant on imported cheese to meet consumption demand. And on this slide, on the left hand of the slide, you can see from the chart that imports have been steadily increasing over the past 30 or so years. Cheese is also the UK's biggest dairy export to Japan, but cheese from the UK still makes up only a tiny fraction of Japan's total cheese imports. And on the chart on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that in 2022, Japan imported only around 135 tons of cheese from the UK. By far the biggest exporters of cheese to Japan are the US, Australia, and New Zealand. And a lot of natural cheese is also imported from the EU, with the top exporters being the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, France, and Italy. So it's important to understand that a big portion of Japan's cheese market is processed cheese. Supermarkets and convenience stores stock a wide variety of different types and flavors of processed cheese, often individually wrapped, which is quite appealing to consumers as they like convenience. And most of the processed cheese is produced domestically. Only a very small amount is imported. So just moving on to challenges and opportunities for UK cheese exporters in Japan. On this slide, I've put some of the key points to think about. So in terms of challenges, price is probably the main issue I think UK cheese exporters face, because UK cheese is comparatively quite expensive and would be considered more of a luxury item by Japanese consumers. And connected to this, cheese imports also still face high tariffs in Japan. But the UK does benefit from a free trade agreement with Japan, which brings the tariff down a bit. So that makes UK cheese more competitive. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a later slide. Adding to the issues of price, an issue particularly at the moment is the weak yen. This is affecting all sectors, not just food and drink, but does mean that imports are relatively more expensive. And finally, apart from price, levels of awareness in Japan about UK cheese are quite low. So Japanese consumers are not particularly familiar with the different types of UK cheese and don't necessarily consider the UK as a cheese producing country. For example, many consumers don't realize that cheddar is actually from the UK. So there are obviously some challenges, but while these challenges exist, there are also many opportunities in Japan. As I've already discussed, cheese consumption has been and continues to increase. And alongside this increase in consumption, awareness of different types of cheese and how to eat them is also increasing. And activities such as the Dairy Showcase and events in Japan that we participate in, such as trade shows and other promotional activities, are also helping to raise awareness amongst Japanese buyers and consumers. There is also a perception among Japanese consumers that cheese has health benefits due to the high calcium and protein content. So some cheeses, such as white mold and blue cheeses, have been marketed as having various different health benefits, and this has increased the popularity of these types of cheese. If these kind of trends continue, we think there's a good opportunity for UK cheese exporters, especially if we can capitalize on the quality and provenance of the produce, because this is something that's really valued by Japanese consumers. I mentioned the free trade agreement earlier, and I think this is another opportunity for UK cheese exporters because the tariff reductions make UK cheese more competitive. And finally, geographical indications. Under our free trade agreement with Japan, we've registered a number of geographical indications for various agricultural products, including cheese. So it's worth checking if your particular type of cheese is registered in Japan as a GI, as this will be an additional USP and help also to illustrate the quality and provenance of your product. So on this slide, I've just listed a few recommendations or tips if you're thinking about the Japanese market. As I've already mentioned, focusing on quality and provenance is really important, particularly given the relatively high price point of UK cheese. I mentioned low levels of awareness, so educating consumers about your product is another really important thing to think about. You need to help Japanese consumers understand the product, how it can be eaten, can it be incorporated into any Japanese dishes, what does it go well with, things like that, for example, are good to consider. Thirdly, utilising the tariff advantages of the free trade agreement, which I will go into in a bit more detail in the next slide. Build strong relationships with your Japanese partner. So in Japan, business relationships are really important and building trust is really, really important. So particularly if you find a good Japanese partner who is willing to put effort into educating buyers and consumers about your product, it's really important that you put the effort in to maintain that relationship. And finally, joining trade shows can be a really good way to get your product directly into the hands and mouths of importers and buyers in Japan. So if you're really serious about the Japanese market, this is something to consider as well. Moving on to talk more about the free trade agreement between the UK and Japan. This is officially called the UK-Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or CEPA. And in this table, you can see the free trade agreement tariffs for different types of cheese. And the different columns in the table show the tariff in different years, so you can see that it will reduce over time, with many tariffs reducing to zero by 2033. This puts UK exporters at a distinct advantage when compared to the WTO tariff rate, which is the rate that would otherwise be applied outside the free trade agreement. And you can see that rate in the last column of this table. It's worth bearing in mind also that some types of cheese are subject to a TRQ, or tariff rate quota, under the free trade agreement, and those cheeses are highlighted in the table in red. And what this means is that Japan has allotted a certain volume of imports which can attract lower tariffs. And after that amount is exceeded, the tariff reverts to the original higher amount. So if your cheese is subject to a TRQ, it's worth looking into how that process works. So very briefly, just looking at other dairy products, I've focused on butter in this slide. I think butter is probably the other product that could present opportunities in Japan, though the tariff is quite high. Domestic consumption of butter in Japan is fairly constant at around 80 to 85,000 tonnes. And at the moment, New Zealand is by far the biggest exporter of butter to Japan, making up around 70% of all imports. France and the Netherlands are the next biggest exporters. And although the UK does export some butter, it's very, very small amounts. And I think that's partly due to the high tariff. And another product that I've not included on this slide is clotted cream. Scones and cream teas are really popular in Japan, and this does bring a good opportunity for clotted cream. But again, one of the main challenges, I think, is price, particularly because a high tariff is applied to clotted cream imports. And there is a quota available for clotted cream, which will attract a lower tariff, but it can be quite competitive. So clotted cream has a good opportunity in the market, but again, you need to think about how to make the best use of the tariff reductions that you might be eligible for. So finally, in this slide, I'm just given some information about the buyers who will be participating in the dairy showcase from Japan. So we have 2 confirmed at the moment, and possibly a third who are waiting to hear from. Both of the confirmed buyers import natural cheese from Europe, including the UK, already. They both focus on cheese, cream, and butter, and Murakawa International also produces processed cheese. Nippon Micellar has its own online shop and also operates stores in department stores, which is a really good place to showcase high quality cheeses, as the customers in those places are usually expecting a higher end product. And Murakawa also operates an online store and has relationships with key retailers across Japan. So they are 2 really, really important potential importers. So we're really pleased that they're participating in the showcase. And that brings me to the end of this overview of the Japan dairy and cheese market. Thanks very much for listening. And if you have any queries at all, I've left my contact details and those of my team member who can help if you want to get in touch with us to ask any questions or for any more details about any of the content that I covered in this presentation. So again, thanks very much for listening, and best of luck with the showcase. Thank you.